Hello, I'm Liam Doyle. I'm chair of the Kilmacud Stillorgan Local History Society, and I'm standing in Ranelagh Gardens Park, a beautiful little park in the leafy suburb of Dublin. And I'm standing beside the statue of Richard Crosbie, a young Richard Crosbie. And who, you might ask, was Richard Crosbie? Well, you'll have heard of the Montgolfier brothers in France, who were famous for hot air ballooning. Well, Richard Crosbie is a remarkable guy, and he was Ireland's first aeronaut. The presentation you're about to see looks at his efforts to become a successful balloonist. And indeed, it also covers that of James Sadler, who was England's first aeronaut, but shared the same dream as Richard Crosbie. That was to fly across the Irish Sea in a balloon. Now, I'm delighted to introduce Brian McMahon, a founding member of the History Society, who's giving the presentation. Brian has been a regular contributor to the Obelisk Journal over the years, but he's been published in his own right, having produced several books on history, the most recent being The Great Famine in Tralee and North Kerry. This was published in 2017. But very interestingly, Brian has also published a book called Ascend or Die, which chronicles the life of Richard Crosbie.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Kilmacud Stillorgan Local History Society. My name is Brian McMahon, and this presentation tells the story of Ireland's place in the history of human flight. We're going back over 200 years and telling the story of Richard Crosbie, an Irishman, and the Sadler family, an English family. They were among the first balloonists, and they had a dream of crossing the Irish Sea by balloon to make an international flight. Richard Crosbie, as you can see here, was born in 1756, and in this image he's described as the celebrated Irish aeronaut. And on the right is James Sadler of Oxford, the first English aeronaut. That was the term that was used for these first balloonists. You can see that we have a question mark over the date of Richard Crosbie's death. 1800 was the year in which he was believed to have died, but later in the talk I'll be able to add a few more years of life to him. Aeronauts was one name for these gentlemen, and another name was balloonists, and another name was balloonatics, because they really were intrepid adventurers, full of daring-do, seeking out danger, full of chutzpah, and they were involved in an extreme sport, full of danger and the prospect of death never very far away. An apology in advance, there will be a lot of hot air in this presentation, I have to say. So this is Richard Crosbie's design for the balloon in which he intended to cross the Irish Sea from Dublin to Wales or even to England. It's an elaborate contraption, as you can see, and it's just incredible to imagine that it might have made that journey. He's described as the father of Irish flight. He was fearless and fanatical and foolhardy. He was a pioneer and a hero. He was an entrepreneur, a scientist, and a showman. 6 foot 3 inches in height and fairly portly from descriptions we have of him at the time. So while it's a story of adventure, it's also a story of mystery and scandal and even murder, because there was a dark side to Richard Crosbie as well. This device he described as his aeronautical chariot, and he did succeed in making the first flight in Ireland, and it was made from Ranelagh Gardens in the Dublin suburb of Ranelagh on the 19th of January 1785, not too long after the first balloon flights had taken place in France and in England. Richard Crosbie was born in County Wicklow, in Baltinglass, near Baltinglass, in the place where this house stands. It was Crosbie Park. It's now called Slaney Park. This wasn't the house he was born in. This was built more after his death, but it still stands today, a large farm. He came from a kind of a noble family. His father was Sir Paul Crosbie, and his brother was executed in 1798 as part of a vendetta that took place in Carlow. And as you can see there, Baltinglass celebrated their connection with Ireland's first airman in 2013 when they had a balloon festival in the town. My connection with the Crosbie family, however, comes from Kerry, because they were well-known landlords in the area of Ardfert and Ballyhaig. The Crosbie home, as you can see on top there, was Ardfert Abbey, And in the adjoining parish of Ballyhaig, which is my native parish, they also had an imposing dwelling called Ballyhaig Castle. And the Wicklow branch from which Richard came was descended from this area. They were in fact originally named Macrossan, but around the 1600s they saw the way things were going, and they cooperated or collaborated, I suppose, with the plantations and with the new administration and the Tudor administration, and they assumed the name Crosby. One of them became a bishop in Ardfert in 1600, and in the 1790s one of them took the title Lord Glandore. Both of these houses are now ruined or gone completely in Kerry. So that's my connection. Ballyhaig Castle, or the ruins of it, was something that was familiar to me from growing up in that village. Coming back to Richard then, he came from Wicklow to school in Trim, and this castle is the St. Mary's Abbey, the remains of St. Mary's Abbey. And while he was at school in Trim, Richard Crosby climbed up to the top of the Yellow Steeple, as it's called. And there is a story that he had made his last will and testament as a schoolboy prank, and when he got to the top, he let it flutter down to the ground. And according to a story, down below was a young Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. And he picked up the will and read it and was dismayed to find that he wasn't mentioned in it. He expected that the man that he looked up to, Richard Crosby, would have left him something in his will, and he was dismayed by it. The story doesn't quite stand up because there was a 15-year gap between Arthur Wellesley and Richard Crosby, so whether they were at school together or not is dubious. So from there, he went to college in Trinity, where he became one of the young college bucks, as depicted here on the left. They were wild young men who terrorised the city of Dublin, which was fairly lawless. There was no great police force or anything to control them, so they were well known. As you can see, this man here has made, out of the big heavy key, he's made a weapon out of it for wielding in the public. Richard did not graduate from the college, but we have an image of him and his activities in the college from his friend Jonah Barrington. On one occasion, Jonah Barrington was challenged to a duel, and he didn't have pistols for a duel, so he got his friend Richard Crosby, who was an ingenious mechanic, as he described him, to put together, lock, stock and barrel, 2 pistols for him for the morning of his duel, which went ahead without anybody being injured. And this is Barrington's description of his friend Crosby in Trinity. He was, beyond comparison, the most ingenious mechanic I ever knew. He had a smattering of all sciences, and there was scarcely an art or trade of which he had not practical knowledge. His chambers at college were like a general workshop of all kind of artisans. He was very good-tempered, exceedingly strong, and brave as a lion, but dogged as a mule. And that doggedness stood to him in later life when he was determined to proceed with his dream of flight. As I mentioned, he was one of the Trinity bucks. Those groups of boys, young men who terrorised the city at that time, they were in 2 gangs, the Ormond Boys and the Liberty Boys. And a group of them were known by the strange name of Pinking Dindies. The Pinking Dindies were young men who were allowed to carry swords, and they left the tips of the swords uncovered so that they could prod and poke and threaten and injure people with the tips of the swords that they carried around their waist. And in Dublin at the time there was a famous woman called Margaret Leeson, also known as Peg Plunkett, who wrote a book of her experiences later, and she was notorious because she was a high-class brothel keeper, a madame. To the gentry and to others. One of her favourites was the Viceroy, the Duke of Rutland, whose name was Charles Manners. And when they went to the theatre, Peg Plunkett would be accompanied by a retinue of her young women, preening themselves, I suppose, at the theatre. And sometimes the young men would jeer at Peg or call out to Peg, "Who did you sleep with last night, Peg?" And she would reply, "Manners, you ruffians, Manners," referring to the Duke of Rutland, whose name was Charles Manners. This book is a source of information about Richard Crosbie and his activities, and this is the darker side that I referred to earlier on. A version of this book has been published recently, edited by Mary Lyons, and it's well worth reading. It still has a lot of the personality of Peg Plunkett and Dublin as it was at the time. But this is Peg's description of an incident that took place, a tragic incident for her. She says, at the time, Dublin was infested with a set of beings. I'll read from the book here. Dublin was infested with a set of beings who, however they might be deemed gentlemen by birth or connections, yet by their actions deserved no other appellation than that of ruffians. They were called pinking dindies, and they derived boldness from their numbers, committed regular irregularities abhorrent to humanity, and gave affronts when together, which singly they would not have had the courage even to attempt. They ran drunk through the streets, knocking down whomever they met. They attacked and beat and cut the watchmen, and with great valour broke open the habitations of unfortunate young girls, demolished the furniture of their rooms, and treated the unhappy sufferers with a barbarity and savageness at which a gang of drunken coal porters would have blushed. At the head of this infamous set was a man who, though of noble family, disgraced them by his behaviour, and who has since made his name famous for contriving to mount nearer to heaven than he had any reason for expecting to arrive. Beautiful writing, beautiful English there, and she was certainly referring to Richard Crosbie as the man who mounted nearer to heaven. So then she describes an attack by Richard Crosbie on her brothel at a time when she was, as she says, very big with child. And the result of it, she says, the result of this attack, which was uncalled for and particularly violent, she sums it up by saying, thus, these magnanimous warriors actually murdered 2 helpless infants. I should say that she also claimed that a 2-year-old daughter of hers died as a result of the incident because of the attack. That was the 2 infants, one in her womb and the other a child of 2 years old. So they murdered 2 helpless infants, bruised and maltreated their defenceless mother, destroyed the furniture of a house, terrified a whole neighbourhood, and wounded some of the watchmen for fun. How void their hearts must be of humanity and true bravery, and how destitute of sense must be their addled brains who can act in this manner, and whilst they act thus and usurp the respectable name of gentlemen, they can have no pretence to courage. So that was her strong condemnation of Richard Crosbie and his fellow students for the way they had behaved towards her, that they had no courage. Well, courage is the quality that, as we'll see later, was something that Richard Crosbie certainly had when it came to flight, but not then. Nevertheless, when he did come to make his flight in Ranelagh some time later, among the crowd, cheering him on and wishing him well, was Peg Plunkett. So she had enough forgiveness in her heart to let that incident pass by, serious as it was. She may have exaggerated, we cannot be sure, but it doesn't reflect well on Richard Crosbie at this time. So I'm going to leave Dublin and Ireland now and just talk about ballooning in general and the dream of flight that mankind has had, I suppose, since the dawn of time, and looking up into the air and wondering about the possibilities since the myth of Icarus flying and so on. So these are examples of the kind of possible gadgets or contraptions that might take off in the air. One with copper cylinders and another one called the passarola, both having the form of ships, as you can see. So there were kind of ideas that the air had a surface on which people might be able to sail or have a boat-like invention. This is now, we're talking about the 1770s, 1780s, the age of enlightenment, the age of invention, the age of experiment and wonder. And it falls to 2 men in rural France in a village called Annonay near Lyon, the Montgolfier brothers. And the year now is 1783, the month of June. These were the sons of a linen manufacturer, and they are said to have noticed once that over the fire, when a shirt was drying, that it sort of rose up in the air, it filled up and it rose. And they wondered about constructing a balloon, and they went ahead with it in this rural area in the month of June in Annonay. They went ahead with getting a balloon to ascend by having a fire underneath it. And it was the linen from their father's factory, stitched together or buttoned together and coated with a kind of a rubberized coating, and they noticed that it took off. And this is regarded as a seminal moment in history, and a lot of interest was taken in it. This was a fire balloon, as it was called at the time, and initially people thought that it was the smoke from the fire which was affecting the rise, the balloon, allowing or enabling the balloon to rise. So the more smoke you could make, the better. So they got all kinds of things like leather and rotten meat and carcasses and dirty straw and wool and anything they could to put it into the fire to make the black smoke to enable it to rise. The word spread, and the fire balloon even went to Paris, as you can see here, with a huge crowd. And the king took an interest in it, and the academy and lots of other people. The next thought was, what about using the balloon to have to transport people eventually, but at first animals. They thought they would experiment with animals. And here you see a sheep and a cock and a duck, which are being raised up in a basket by a balloon and flying off over the countryside. And of course, where they landed then would be some miles away, to the astonishment of the people who saw this balloon emerging with the animals from the sky. So it was found that it didn't have any great harmful effect on the animals, and the question arose of sending humans up by balloon. And at first there was a suggestion that they should get maybe a couple of criminals, so that if an accident happened and if they were killed, they wouldn't be missed, particularly if they were under a death sentence, if they had took some men from death row and tried to experiment with them. But somebody pointed out that if it was a successful flight, then these criminals would become famous as the first men to fly. So that didn't take off. Here you have an example of the effect of a balloon landing among the peasantry as well. You can see people are out with pitchforks and muskets, and the dogs are barking, and the priest is coming to bless it because they imagined that it was something descending from the heavens, bringing a curse on them. This was the effect on them. We're moving on still in the year 1783, and the first manned flight, which took place in November 1783 in Paris, from the Bois de Boulogne, I think. And this image of the first aerostatic globe, as it's described here, with two men, one on either side, taking off a fire balloon. The thing is to keep to keep heating the air and to keep it expanding. They also had a brazier on board, as well as having a fire at ground level to get it up in the air. They had a brazier on board. Highly dangerous, of course, because sparks from that could fly onto the linen or the canvas that they were using and set fire to it, and that they might have all descended. One of the reasons why these flights drew a lot of spectators was because some of them expected a great disaster or a great tragedy to happen. But it was something amazing, something elevating, something wondrous for people to look up into the sky and see other human beings floating above them and looking down on them. And this is what happened. The two men are Pilatre de Rosière and the Marquis d'Arlandes. Pilatre de Rosière was the pilot, really, the man who had a real interest in it. The Marquis was a nobleman who was sponsoring it. And from time to time, when they were in the balloon, Pilatre de Rosière had to shout at his companion, telling him to stoke up the brazier and to remember where he was, because he was more intent on admiring the view. The symbolism of it has been well expressed by one writer who said that man's umbilical tie to Mother Earth was broken. And that was true. They were defying gravity, they were astonishing people, and that they were doing something that was unheard of. The flight took 25 minutes and it came down in what is today the Place d'Italie, about 9,000 yards away. And these images of the balloon flying over the Seine, as you can see here, became seminal. So this is a fire balloon. Now, at the same time, as it happened, there were scientists working hard in Paris, also developing another kind of balloon by coincidence, really. And this was a hydrogen balloon, which of course would be safer, even though there were dangers involved in this as well. And these were two men, Charles and Robert. Charles was a scientist and Robert as well. And these had developed a different kind of balloon which didn't require fire and did away with the dangers of sparks flying and the whole thing going up in flames. Charles is probably known to school children because in physics they still learn Charles' law about the expansion of air as far as I remember. But here it is, a hydrogen balloon flying over Paris, and this is December 1783. So within a month of the first human flight, these two men were flying in a hydrogen balloon. And the thing here was to seal the hydrogen in the envelope, as it was called, that was another name for the globe or for the balloon itself, and to use a valve then to release it to come down. So getting it to the right, getting the right amount of hydrogen in and then sealing it effectively and then releasing it to come back to Earth. And this was a hydrogen balloon. So at the beginning, the fire balloon was called a Montgolfier, and the hydrogen balloon was called a Charlier. And here again you have the image of it. And we're already seeing that it has become a kind of an artistic creation, a lovely creation, as is appropriate, I suppose, to a French invention. And so the era of human flight had begun. And there were some famous French balloonists. This man is Jean-Pierre Blanchard. He's a man who made about 60 flights in his lifetime, very successful balloonist. And the design of balloons changed as time went on as well. This is one of Blanchard's, and you can see there's a kind of a parachute element to this. But there was always the idea that it was akin to a ship. They were still aeronauts, and here you can see a propeller kind of device on it. And in the next one, a rudder. And sails were often attached to them as well. So these were, and oars in this case as well, as if they were rowing through the air. A kind of balloon fever came about at this time among the public, both in France and eventually in England. In France, it was highly scientific. In England, it became more of a spectacle, particularly under this man, Vincent Lunardi, who was an Italian living in England, a secretary to the ambassador, and he was the first man to make a balloon flight in England in September 1784. He was also very dashing and attractive and quite a showman. And these are the kind of displays that he put on, drawing great crowds here. And as you can see, he's using the Union Jack emblem to attract people. At an early stage, an American named Benjamin Franklin was in Paris, and he was aware of these developments. And somebody asked, what is the point of these balloons? It's all very frivolous, but what are they achieving for us? What are they but playthings and toys and so on? But Benjamin Franklin countered by asking, of what use is a newborn babe? In other words, it was the beginning of something that might develop into something much more than it was at the time. Coming back to England, I mentioned the name Sadler, and this is James Sadler, who lived in Oxford. He wasn't an academic, though. He was a baker in Oxford, and he was the first English aeronaut, as it says here on the slide, who in a fire balloon made a successful attempt near this place on the 4th of October 1784. So again, a year after it began in France, there was an Englishman flying, October 1784. Here you can see the image became the darling of illustrators and magazines and cartoonists again. You can see people falling over themselves here outside a pub called the Mermaid, cheering on the balloonists and enjoying the spectacle. And here you have somebody dropping a parachute from a balloon and frightening the horses, as you can see, tumbling over the carriage. Next one again, it had an influence on fashions. The ballooning aspect of clothing comes about, and the possibilities that we might all have individual balloons which might transport us from place to place is envisaged in this one here. So it became a favourite kind of theme for hats and gowns and garters and cigar cases and snuff boxes and fabrics and china. There was a big merchandising element to all of this from the very beginning, and a consumerist and marketing element to balloons. And indeed, you can still see balloons as a design theme in advertising and in fabrics and in wallpapers and curtains and so on. And then there were some risque cartoons as well about this one, which is entitled Love in a Balloon, male and female, and the fun they might have rising above the earth in the basket there. And in this one, the pneumatic possibilities of the balloon. So that's the story of ballooning in Europe, and the dates that I gave you, 1783 first of all, and then 1784, back in Ireland. Somehow or other, Richard Crosbie was made aware of these developments in France, and in the month of February 1784, 6 months after the 6 or 8 months, say, after the developments in Annonay, the first flight, and just a few months after the first human flight, in February 1784, Richard Crosbie declared that he would cross the Irish Sea by balloon, and that his balloon would have a feature that others didn't have, that he would make it dirigible. In other words, that he could steer it and direct it, because all the other balloons we've spoken about were subject to the winds. The prevailing winds would lead it wherever they wanted, not wherever the pilots intended, the balloonists intended. So Crosbie claimed that his would be dirigible and he could direct it in the way that he wanted. And you can see this imaginative device here. There's a rudder type, there's a aspect to it, there's a propeller aspect to it, two propellers, one on either side, and there are sails on it, and it's hanging from the envelope then as well. This wasn't the one he eventually took flight in, but this certainly was his design, and I like this one here, which was coloured in at the time, and the background there is of Dublin. So this is February 1784. That was his announcement. This was a kind of a golden age in Dublin. It was Georgian Dublin, but as somebody has said, it was a kind of a Georgian mask. Beneath all the Georgian splendour, there was also a lot of crime and squalor and degradation as well. It was the second city of the empire, and the Duke of Rutland, Charles Manners, whom I've mentioned already, was the Lord Lieutenant, and he set the tone, and his wife here, Isabella, the Duchess of Rutland, very young, but set the tone for entertainment and enjoyment and public spectacles and so on. These were people who were sponsors of Crosbie's and admirers of his, and promoted and attended the events where he made the public aware of his ballooning experiments. Another man who was significant at the time was the elder statesman Lord Charlemont, who had a great regard for Crosbie. He described Crosbie as a truly amiable and sensible man. Charlemont was a skeptic about balloons. He said, I detest balloons, which I look on as the silly invention of a trifling age. But, he said, my friendship for Crosbie has induced me to support him. He really is an excellent man. My affection for him, which is really great, has alone induced me to patronise his plans, and every balloon but Crosbie's is odious to me. So he was an admirer of Crosbie's, and he consequently lent him his support. And that support was invaluable, because this was an expensive hobby, an expensive business to get his balloon together and to organise the flights. And in order to make some money, Crosbie exhibited his balloon here in the round room of the Rotunda, which had been built some 20 years before or so. And that's where he would charge the public to come in and see it. And from there, as well as having displays there, he also had public events in Ranelagh Gardens, which was a kind of a pleasure gardens at the time, a small park in Ranelagh. And in the pleasure gardens, there were masked balls and evenings of musical entertainment and floodlit events, I suppose, and torchlit events and so on. And this was owned by a man named Hollister, and it was where the gentry went to preen and posture and to liaise and so on. And this is where Crosbie chose to have displays of his models. And from there, he did experimental flights of smaller balloons, which included sending off some animals in baskets on a balloon out to sea, which was the way the prevailing winds went. And with them, there would be a note saying, would the finder please contact Richard Crosbie in Dublin and give details of where this was found and so on. A little bit cruel to the animals, but that's what the experiment was. And on one occasion, there were fishermen out in the Irish Sea who witnessed this apparition coming from the heavens, a balloon with a basket and an animal attached, and they were amazed by it. And there's a description of their reaction. The terrors of the fishermen can be better imagined than described. They fell flat upon their faces, trembling, groaning, and howling. One exclaimed that it was the devil, another that it was the plague from Constantinople. Lord have mercy on us, says a third. And at length one man plucked up enough courage then to stand up and challenge it, and they heard the cat expiring, going meow, and all of these sounds frightened the sailors. This is Ranelagh Gardens as it looks today. It's much smaller in dimensions, but it's still there with a lake, and it's a lovely little pleasure garden, not so well known, but known to local people. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about the technical side of the hydrogen balloon, which was Crosby's balloon. To generate the hydrogen, they required sulfuric acid, iron filings, and water mixed together in the proper combination. And this is how it was set up then. This platform here would show you the envelope was lying flat, and with all those barrels attached to it, the hydrogen was generated first of all, and then went into the envelope and filled it up, and at a certain point when they were happy, they sealed the valve and let it take off released it from the supports, the wooden supports which had held it. It's very elaborate and also very dangerous. This is a drawing of Lunardi's equipment, and you can see how much time it would take and how much scientific knowledge, and again it was highly dangerous also. And this all had to be done in advance of any flight. Time consuming and unpredictable in more ways than one. Unpredictable in time, so that crowds were often kept waiting for ages, but also the gas was very volatile. So as well as a volatile crowd impatient from waiting, there was always the danger of an explosion. Here is how it was described in Paris. These were the possibilities. In a small enclosed courtyard, in a densely populated section of the city, a handful of largely inexperienced people were collecting an unprecedented quantity of the most inflammable gas known through a tube too hot to touch into the confinement of a rubberized bag that was close to catching fire if it was not first chewed through by sulfuric acid. So that was the kind of danger that was involved. Crosby then, just going back to the dates, decided that on the 4th of January 1785, a year maybe roughly after his first announcement, he was ready to attempt the flight across the Irish Sea to Britain. And so he gathered people together from all over the city, announcing it by beating of the drum throughout the city and through the newspapers. Crowds gathered in Ranelagh, and nothing happened. Crosby's balloon would not ascend on that day for weather conditions and wind conditions and so on. Always the bane of balloonists' decision making. And it was a great disappointment. People had left their workplaces and left their homes, and thousands had gathered, and traffic arrangements had to be made. And Crosby was subjected to heavy satire from local magazines. I'll read you a little bit of how one paper described it. The children cried, for Crosby's balloon could not ascend. The missus tittered, for Crosby's balloon could not ascend. Their mammas scolded, for Crosby's balloon could not ascend. Some looked sullen, some looked sulky, some laughed, some cried, and all were affected. 438 titled ladies fainted. 73 miscarried, 9 of them of twins. 1,932 drowned in the mud and were overwhelmed by wheels running over them. 789 are missing, dead or dead drunk, all, thank God, of the populace. So they compared it to the grand old Duke of York. Crosby was leading people up the hill and then leading them down again with nothing happening. That was on the 4th of January. On the 7th of January 1785, word came from England that the first international flight, the first crossing of a channel of water, the crossing of the channel from Dover to Calais, had been achieved by Blanchard, the man I mentioned earlier. It was a great significant moment as well in human flight, the first international flight, and as a reward, Blanchard got a donation, a grant of £2,000 from the King and a pension for life. So Crosby, I suppose, maybe was hoping for something like that if he had been successful in crossing from Dublin to Wales, to Holyhead, say. So That was the 7th of January. The flight of the 4th of January failed. Crosby tried again on the 19th of January 1785, and this is the occasion on which he was successful. And I go back to my original image of him here, where he was described as the celebrated Irish aeronaut. He was a showman and an exhibitionist, as well as being a scientist, and you can see that from his dress. This is the first pilot's uniform. He wore a robe of oiled silk lined with white fur, a waistcoat and breeches made of quilted satin, Moroccan boots, and a Montero cap or turban, which he's holding in his hand here, made from leopard skin. The flight was to take place at 11 in the morning, but it didn't actually happen until about 2:40 p.m. Estimates of the crowd vary, but 20,000, 30,000, 50,000 would have been mentioned. He was successful. He mounted awfully majestic, as descriptions had at the time, while the air resounded with the shouts, the prayers, the admiration of the delighted multitude. And a spring of ecstatic joy appeared to animate his countenance. Newspapers described him as Hibernia's favourite son and the true Columbus of the trackless air. And this iconic image from the time shows a building in the background, and there on the left the props that would have supported the poles, that would have supported the framework of the balloon, and then the animation of the crowds. The building that is shown there was still in Ranelagh Gardens, and this is what it looked like up to the 1980s or so. It was a convent, a Carmelite convent, which closed down in the 1980s. So this is the first flight in Ireland by Richard Crosby, and it was a short one. It simply went across the Liffey and came down in Clontarf, so it may have been only 15-20 minutes long. And from Clontarf, Crosby was brought shoulder high and the balloon into the home of Lord Charlemont, his sponsor, which was on Rutland Square, and this of course is now Parnell Square, and the house is now the Hugh Lane Gallery, and this is where he was received, and to great acclaim, as you can imagine. A contemporary newspaper, has an account of it. And again, this contraption, which wasn't quite, he dropped the rudder and the sails and simply had a basket underneath it. And on the right of that image there is Crosby himself posting a notice in the newspaper thanking people for their support. You might see that the date there is 30th of January 1783. That's a misprint. It should be 1785. And the address was North Cumberland Street. That's where Crosby had his home. Now demolished. There are no 18th century buildings remaining on that street. As in France, there was a commercial element to it, and this is a key ring, I suppose, or some ornament of some kind with the balloon image on it, and inscribed around the edge of it is just the word Crosby. And the event has been commemorated. It's certainly not forgotten in Ranelagh, and nationwide as well, because in 1985 this stamp, using the image from the time, this stamp commemorated the flight as well, the first flight by an Irishman, and the image was also used by Deirdre Kelly in her well-known book Four Roads to Dublin. And of course he is a local hero, Richard Crosby, in Ranelagh and Ranelagh Gardens, where this statue was by Rory Breslin was erected to him in more recent times. And that is a focal point for the people of Ranelagh. As you can see there, it's a young boy, but he has the face of a mature person, and in his hand he has one hand he has a boomerang and a paper aeroplane, and coming out of his head a propeller, a head full of ideas, I suppose it depicts there as well, and images of flight as they were. And he wasn't forgotten, as I say, in Ranelagh, because at one time there was a pub called the Richard Crosby Tavern there as well. And more recently, for a short while, this mural was on the gable of a house. It has gone since. And in recent times also in Ranelagh, there was a famous event called Ranelagh Arts Festival. It took place every year, and it was the dream of the committee of the Ranelagh Arts Festival to recreate the flight from Ranelagh Gardens. And with the help of a well-known balloonist, Tom McCormack, this eventually happened. This succeeded. I think the year might have been 2012 or so. I'm not sure exactly what year. So it was a fitting memorial to him to recreate it. Not an easy thing to do in modern times. Special permission had to be got, and the time of year was it was important. You know, the prevailing winds and so on. No balloonist nowadays would want to be blown out across the Irish Sea, because it would be too expensive to recover the balloon from the sea, and more dangerous also. So that was the first of 3 flights in Dublin by Richard Crosbie in the year 1785. He next decided to ascend from what was Royal Barracks and is now Collins Barracks and part of Dublin Museum, as we know. It was the money-making side of a balloon flight was limited enough, because as soon as the balloon rose up, of course, anybody could see it from anywhere. So people reasoned, why pay to go inside just to see the beginning or the initial part of it, when you can see the balloon from any part of the city. So perhaps the enclosed area of the yard here in Royal Barracks afforded a chance to make more money and to ensure that people paid for the spectacle. So this was, like a lot of balloon flights, quite a fiasco, because initially the balloon had to rise high enough to get over the high, 4-storey barrack buildings that are around it here. And this proved a difficulty. As I said, Richard Crosbie was 6'3" and he was quite heavy. And because of his weight in particular and the other ballast in the balloon would not rise and would not take off from Collins Barracks on the day appointed. Once again, Crosbie picked a day, and with the showman's touch, the day he picked was Ascension Thursday. Very appropriate for him. But on that day, the crowd was once again disappointed. And there was a slight turning here now, because he was going from hero to zero, really. Balloons had become more controversial, and he was accused of bringing people out of their workplaces and fooling the people and making money from the people and drawing them together under false pretenses and then letting them down at the last minute. So he was described as a manoeuvrer and a balloon schemer. And there had been an incident in Tullamore when an experiment with a fire balloon had caused a great fire to burnt a lot of the thatched roofs of buildings, because it had come down on a thatched roof and the fire spread from one house to another. So there was a kind of a change of mood with regard to ballooning, and the accusations of swindling swirled around Richard Crosbie. But in fact, he lost money on all the flights that he attempted, really, because he never covered his costs. So the Ascension Thursday attempt failed, and Crosbie promised publicly that he would ascend or die in the attempt on the 12th of May 1785. Ascend or die, he said. And we have a description of this incident from an onlooker, not someone in Collins Barracks but elsewhere, as we'll see. This slide is difficult to read. I'll just read the first line. She says, Mr. Crosbie has made the town wild. But instead of reading that, her actual manuscript, I have just transcribed it here, and I'll read it for you because it's a good summary of what happened on this occasion. Crosbie himself did not succeed in making the flight. Mr. Crosbie has made the town wild. All this day he was to ascend with his balloon at 12 from the barracks. I was quite satisfied with seeing him go up before from Ranelagh, therefore I stayed quiet at home, but my daughters went, with General and Mrs. Massey, to the park. But I saw almost as much as they did, for the balloon came over the Rotunda and Ballybock Bridge, and I sat looking at it for an hour, till it appeared no larger than a small bowl. It was an uncommon clear day. Mr. Crosbie did not go up with it, for he was too heavy, and it would not ascend with him, but a Mr. Maguire, a fine-spirited young man of the college. It was thought he went out to sea, and there is now a report that the balloon burst, and he fell into the sea and was saved by a boat. And this lady's summary was exactly that. Crosbie was substituted by a much lighter, much thinner young man from Trinity College called Maguire, and the balloon took off without incident from Royal Barracks, clearing the roofs, and headed off in the direction of Howth. And from Howth, the balloon drifted out to sea when Maguire had second thoughts about this adventure, and he released the valve and the balloon fell into the sea, from where he was rescued by fishermen. You can see in this image here the fishermen are rescuing him, and there on the right are the young gentlemen, balloon chasers, who had followed the balloon from Royal Barracks out towards Howth and prevailed on the fishermen, pay them to go out and rescue the young man Maguire. Here is another image of it with an outsize Maguire being rescued by the fishermen. Ironically, Maguire, when he came back, was feted and feasted. He was knighted and made an officer. He got a medal from Trinity College. He was received by the Lord Lieutenant Richard Maguire. And the man behind it all, Richard Crosbie, didn't receive any of these rewards or acclaim. So that was Crosbie's second attempt. His third attempt, again with the help of another noble sponsor, the Duke of Leinster, took place from Leinster Lawn, the lawn of Leinster House, Dáil Éireann today, on the Merrion Square side of it. On this occasion, Richard Crosbie wore a cork jacket, a kind of a life jacket, I suppose, and that was very much part of his equipment. And once again, he was successful. This time, he did go out to sea and travelled, and we have a description of his reaction, a long description. He was taking readings and taking soundings and described what he saw. I won't give you too much detail on it, but he was very confident that all would go well for him on this flight. He wrote, "My course now bid so fair for success that I experienced more happiness and transport in the idea than I believe before ever fell to the lot of man. My mind, that was hitherto voluptuously fed, made me inattentive to the cravings of my appetite, which at length grew rather pressing, and with my pen in one hand and part of a fowl in the other, I wrote as I enjoyed my delicious repast." He later said it was impossible to give the human imagination an adequate idea of the unspeakable beauties which the scenery of the sea, bounded by both lands, presented. It was such as would make me risk a life to enjoy again. He claimed that he could see both the shore of Ireland and the shore of Wales from where he was. But once again he got into difficulties. This is Leinster Lawn as it looks today. Crosbie got into difficulties with squalls of wind and hailstones, hail showers, he says, and the balloon came down in the sea and he was rescued by fishermen. He was being tracked by boats as well, going out to sea. So they were there to rescue him. He was brought back and came into Blackrock House, which still stands today, where he had breakfast and recovered from his ordeal. He was happy with that, although he hadn't achieved his aim of crossing the Irish Sea. This is an image from the period as well, and a report. You can see that this one shows that it's quite simply a balloon and a basket. There are no sails or rudders or oars or anything like that. And other surrounding images there tell us that Macbeth was on in the Theatre Royal in Smock Abbey. And he was celebrated once again after this, but there's no doubt there was a certain balloon fatigue setting in, certainly in Dublin, and a weariness at the disappointments of all of this, and I suppose the initial glow about it all had worn off, but not so in the provinces. And that's what maybe encouraged him. He received an invitation to go to Limerick and perform a flight there, which he did. And that's where we next hear of him in 1786, in early 1786. And this is an image of Limerick from that time, which on the far left there shows the balloon as if it was a permanent feature of it. He took off from the House of Industry, or the Workhouse, which still stands in Limerick, and with no particular destination in this mind. It was just a display for the public. They were supposed to have been, again, the usual thousands and thousands of people watching. He spent an hour and 18 minutes over the city, and the flight took 3.5 hours in total. He had fantastic aerial views, and he described having his dinner, a chicken dinner and a bottle of wine, while he was in the basket as well. He claimed to have gone as far as Tarbert, and that he saw Killarney, and eventually he came down in a place called Ballygirreen or Rhinana, near Newmarket-on-Fergus, and indeed not too far away from today's Shannon Airport, appropriately. There's an account of it from the news, from a letter at that time as well, which I'll just read. I'll just read for you here. I have just time to inform you that yesterday at 4 o'clock, Mr. Crosby ascended in his balloon from the House of Industry. It was a prospect beautiful beyond description. The sky, being remarkably clear, contributed to gratify above 50,000 spectators with the sight of this brave and successful aeronaut for an hour and 17 minutes, it being his determination, at ascending, to remain as long as possible stationary in view of the city. At a few minutes before 8 o'clock, he was observed by glasses to take a direction towards Ennis. And there, as well as in the village of 6 Mile Bridge, the inhabitants were enraptured with the sight of him. He descended at 8 o'clock near Dromoland, the seat of Sir Lucius O'Brien, Baronet. That was Crosby's last flight in Ireland. There was a question of an invitation to Belfast to fly there, but it never happened. Ranelagh continued to be a place where people had flights, and this report of Mr. and Mrs. Durry flying from Ranelagh Gardens indicates perhaps the first woman to fly in Ireland, as far as I can confirm anyway, that was the first woman to fly. I'm moving briefly now to Mr. Sadler, whom I mentioned earlier on. He comes to Ireland in 1812 with the same ambition. He was the first Englishman to fly, but 1812, what is that, 27 years later or so, when he comes to achieve what Crosby had failed to achieve, to fly from Dublin to Holyhead, or to England maybe. And this was his advertisement. You can't read it all there, but it is September 1812, announcing this to the nobility and then letting people know by drumbeat around the city. He gave an account of it afterwards. He took off from Belvedere House, Drumcondra, which is now part of St. Patrick's College, Drumcondra. And there is a fine image of him flying over Poolbeg here. You can see perhaps one of his flags. It has the 3 castles of Dublin, and the inscription, the motto on the basket of the balloon, is Éireann go bragh. Sadler, this is James Sadler. He had quite an adventure on this 1812 flight, and you can track it here. He was, as you can see, driven zigzag out to sea, and he did indeed fly over part of Anglesey, but he was determined to reach Liverpool and thought that he might, but in fact he didn't. And you can see there where the large star is, that's where he came down on his, that's where he was picked up. He came down into the sea and had to be rescued. So it was a failure. He didn't achieve his aim of crossing the Irish Sea in 1812, but he came to Ireland again in 1817, and this time, this is depicts an 1816 one. In 1817, he came with his son, 21-year-old son, Wyndham Sadler, and they set off from Portobello Barracks in Dublin and achieved, Wyndham on his own, but with his father in the background helping him. Wyndham succeeded in doing what neither Crosby nor James Sadler could do. He had crossed the Irish Sea, and his journey, as you can see here, is the lower line, the green line. Quite uneventful, quite easy to do, great conditions, and simply arrived in Anglesey near Holyhead, where in fact after his flight above the earth he took part in a deep sea diving exhibition soon after arriving, just to show that he could soar above the earth and he could go beneath the earth under water as well, as part of the adventures of the time. In a way, by this stage, you know, a lot had happened in European and Irish history between 1784 and 1817. As you imagine, we're talking the French Revolution and 1798 and Act of Union and so on. Much had changed, and the frenzy that had accompanied, and the interest and the fever that had accompanied the early ballooning experiments had dissipated a little bit, and it was somewhat of an anti-climax. Just as a little postscript to that there's a lot of detail in this, but it says that also in 1817, from Portobello, Miss Thompson and Mr. Livingston would attempt to fly, and that they would release a parachute with an animal from it. And already the ballooning has become a bit of a circus show in a way. Sadly, young Wyndham Sadler died in a fall from a balloon in 1824, aged 28. So 7 years after making that flight, he died. His father, James, died in poverty. As an older man, he died in 1828, and this is a tomb. This marks his tomb, which was erected on the bicentenary of his flight. Blanchard's wife became one of the first women balloonists, and she too had a tragic end. She fell to her death on the roofs of Paris. I think the balloon caught fire and she was tossed out of the basket and fell to her death. And as I say, through the 1800s then, ballooning still retained its spectacle side and its circus side, but it became somewhat absurd and dangerous. This happened. A man on horseback ascended in a balloon, and a brass band went up on a balloon to entertain people as well. So these are the kind of events that took place later. Some of the cartoonists continued to have a lot of fun with speculation about what might happen. Here is a line of balloon taxis taking people from hither and thither. As you can see, one writer wrote about it saying, "The time may come, perhaps it now approaches, when we may use balloons like ships and coaches, travel through nations which the sky enshrouds, and sail for future commerce in the clouds." All that came to pass, but in a different form of flight, not balloons, but another form of flight. This is an event that takes place in Ireland every year, an international championship, hot air ballooning. It generates a lot of fine photographs and a lot of fine images. It is a sport today, an expensive sport, and they are what some people thought of them from the beginning. They are playthings. They were dismissed as toys and baubles and playthings, but in some ways too, they kind of are symbols of man's longings or people's longings for flight and eternal longings and the unknown, symbols of transcendence, I suppose, people's desire to rise above the mundane and the normal. And at the very least, balloonists still continue to lift our spirits when we look up at them, as Crosby lifted and Sadler lifted the spirits of the people of their time. They made people more air-minded and made people think of the possibilities. The ballooning escapades of Richard Crosby in Dublin, in Ireland, took place over just a period of 18 months. And this lonely impulse of delight, which drove him and other people to the skies, continues to have an impact on people today. These are balloons in various settings, and they are the inspiration for an artist called Rebecca Kahn today, who does some fine work in ceramics. I travelled once on a balloon myself, thanks to Tom McCormack, and this image is from that. This is the jet that is used to heat up the air and so on. And they are fire balloons again, rather than hydrogen balloons, I suppose, nowadays. And it so happened that down in Baltinglass, in the very place where Richard Crosby came from, part of the festival that I mentioned, balloons took off from the lawn of the house that was there. That would seem to be the end of Richard Crosby, because he just disappears from the pages of history. After his flight in Limerick, it seems that he had one more flight, which was a flight from all the people that he owed money to. And he just seemed to go out of the history books and the news reports. Nothing more heard of him until I did some digging for the book that I wrote on him, and I found a reference to him in the Irish Times of 1911. And this is the reference which I found. History repeats itself. History has once more repeated itself, but with a curious reversal in the order of things. Ireland's first aeronaut, Richard Crosby of Crosby Park, County Wicklow, the first to make the attempt to cross the Channel in a balloon, ended his days as an actor on the American stage. And they go on to talk about Mr. Lorraine. An actor on the American stage. This was the first I'd heard about it, or indeed anybody else had heard about it. So I did some work, and with great help from librarians in New York Public Library and elsewhere, I found accounts of him as an actor. Not very flattering, I'm afraid. The accounts were he could play the parts of a gentleman, and he could speak and had the accent and the language for it, but not maybe the acting ability. It was said that he was always in debt. The little references to him, the short references to him in histories of the theatre in Americas tell us that. He was described as pudding-faced. He was described as having the gait of a greyhound that has the dropsy. His bearing was the reverse of majestic. Another quote, his ill-formed figure, his swollen stomach, and his long spidery legs. Unfortunately, he wasn't a great success as an actor, but I suppose because of the way he spoke, he could carry off something and maybe got some small parts. Kind of a sad epilogue to his life. Presumably, he had a wife and a daughter, at least, perhaps other children. He possibly left those behind him in Ireland. It seems that he did. But more than that, another reference then turned up to him from New York also, in the year 1800, the year in which he was said to have died. And this reference, I'll just read a few here because it's hard to make out, and it just says, balloon to be launched, according to Mr. Crosby's promise to those who attended his lecture and experiments last Tuesday evening, and to convey an idea of the magnificent ascent to those who have never seen one, he will liberate his beautiful varnished silk balloon and something romantic carriage with a living cat or dog from Vernon Garden this day in October 1800. Richard Crosby is continuing once again in 1800 with his ballooning experiments in New York, entertaining the people and talking about the scientific side of it and his varnished silk balloon, and once again sending up the unfortunate animals as an experiment. It's quite remarkable. And following that, I had more success in getting an account of from Baltimore, Maryland, in 1819, 19 years later, of two young men, members of the Freemasons, who came across a sad old man living in a hovel, physically and mentally falling into ruin, as they described it. They found out that he was an Irishman, and he said they wanted to make it to reconnect him with his people and look after him again. But he said to them, my conduct has cut me off from my own age and class. He was living in poverty, not quite in the full of his senses, I'm afraid, and they took pity on him. This was Richard Crosby. This was he. And they arranged with Freemasons in Dublin to have him brought back to Ireland. Little more is known about him, but we can say that he lived until 1824, rather than dying in 1800, which is how he was depicted in, say, the Dictionary of Irish Biography and so on. He lived until 1824, and there is a brief notice of his death in one of the papers, the Freeman's Journal, I think, of the time. But it was without any great public recognition or anything like that. I don't know where he was buried. I'd love to find out sometime. And his widow survived him, because we have a record of her applying for some help for him as well during that time, when he was, even though he returned to Ireland, he was still living in poverty. It's a sad postscript to a brief period, a man who had a brief period of great fame and notoriety. Just to say, there is a book about the Sadlers in particular, published recently by Mark Davies, using that fine image as the cover. And my own book was launched in Ranelagh in 2010 as part of Ranelagh Arts Festival. If you look closely here, some people in the audience might recognise themselves. This is Terry Connaughton, who was a great supporter of mine and a great encourager. And this is on the Triangle in Ranelagh. And appropriately enough, on the evening of the launch, which was set for a certain time, the whole crowd was kept waiting, including the Lord Mayor of Dublin and others, because there was a celebrity guest on the occasion. And this was the well-known Irish woman who came from Ranelagh, an Irish film star, Maureen O'Hara. Here she is on the stage. She was coming from her home in West Cork, and she was about 90 minutes late, I think, and we were all anxiously waiting for her arrival, but she was entitled perhaps to that privilege. And it was also a reminder of just how the people had to wait for Crosby's launches as well. So the book that was launched on that occasion is called Ascend or Die, Richard Crosby, Pioneer of Balloon Flight, and it is available through the website of Kilmacud Stillorgan Local History Society. Thank you very much.